live and subsequent broadcast via the Council's internet site. Officers will introduce themselves when speaking. I'll now move on to the item 2. Apologies for absence.
No apologies received, Chair.
Item 3. Urgent business.
None reported, Chair.
Item 4. Declaration of interest. Does anybody have declaration of interest? Okay. Reyes.
Thanks, Chair. Just to note, even though it doesn't have any impact on the BDO report, that I have worked with the senior manager on this assignment before in my previous role at Deloitte.
Thank you. That's noted. Any declaration of, sorry, we passed that. So any deputations and petitions?
None received, Chair.
Okay. Minutes from the last meeting, which was held at 8th of October 2024. If members can quickly go through the minutes and let me know if there's any amendments or any additions. I'll give you just a couple of seconds and just let me know if you agree to the minutes. All good? Yep, are we agreed? Thank you. Now I'll move on to the action tracker. So we have Officer Jonathan Kirby. He's going to update us on the commercial properties audit. Is that right? Yeah, Jonathan, can you just come please, come forward?
Thank you, Chair. So Jonathan Kirby, Interim Director for Placemaking and Housing. Just providing a verbal update on the commercial property audit, which received a limited assurance prior to bringing a full report through for the committee on the 27th of January. Firstly, apologies for not bringing a full report through this evening. Entirely down to myself and an error in missing some information in October. So apologies to the committee for that. But colleagues, in terms of Andrew Meek and Sarah, will be able to give some updates into the work that we've been doing to give some verbal reassurances to the board on what we're undertaking. And then, as I say, we'll be bringing through a full report. For myself, in terms of just part of the introduction, as you'll know, we've attended this committee previously, following reports that were carried out by Mazars, which were at the request of the previous director and myself in my AD capacity. That particular audit had a nil assurance. And at the time, if you recall, we were in the progress of then taking through to Cabinet our strategic asset management and property improvement plan, which is when we highlighted that it would be a 3 to 5 year journey as outlined in that plan of improvement. Now, I appreciate that a limited assurance is by no means where we want to be, but it is showing progress in a positive direction of systems and processes that we're putting in place, which Andrew and Sarah will be able to update on. So if I hand over.
Yeah, so good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Meek. I'm Interim Assistant Director for Capital Projects and Property. And with me is Sarah Lavery, who's Head of Property. So as Jonathan outlined, we've moved from nil assurance to limited assurance, and obviously we want to get ourselves to a position in a fullness of time where we've got full assurance. I think what the report that we'll bring forward in January will show you is that kind of across the quite large number of action areas that we've got, there's good progress being made, but equally it's not all plain sailing either, because I think colleagues will be aware that the findings were broad and detailed, and we were starting from a position a couple of years back that was very far from satisfactory. I think I'll ask Sarah to talk a bit more about some of this, and particularly would highlight the work that we're doing to deal with debt and arrears and engaging with our tenants in order to deal with expired or held over leases, renew them, and the progress that we're making is quite significant in that area, because and what you can see that through the sort of rent roll, which is improving, year over year. It's significantly better. There are also some good progress in some of the kind of safety aspects of this. So there were 4 recommendations, one which was a sort of general health and safety recommendation, and then a number that was below that, which are around things like fire safety and other safety aspects. And in all of those cases, what we're in the process of doing is based on the corporate policies that we have for in relation to health and safety, is to address that through that process of renewing leases. It's probably also fair to say, to sort of manage expectations, that one of the areas that is more difficult for us is around managing the data. There's a recommendation about the management of data, which is at the heart of the of managing our property. The acquisition of a new property management system is a key part of what we want to do to be able to manage the data better. We've not made as much progress in relation to that as we'd have liked to, and the reason for that is fundamentally to do with having to take stock of the council's overall financial situation and make sure that we make a robust business case to support the acquisition of that new system. So that bit is a little bit behind, and what that does mean is it has a knock-on effect across the other areas that we will be going through in the report. So Sarah, I don't know if you want to add to any of that. No, okay. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Just around the managing of the data. I sit on other audit committees in the housing space where this is another challenge. But the approach is not to look at a new system. So I guess my question is, how confident are we that the data we currently have is valid, accurate, and complete before we even start thinking about a new system? Because the reality is managing data is not necessarily reliant on a new system. So can you give us the level of confidence that the service has in terms of how accurate our data is?
Yeah, so I think we're very clear that the data is held in different systems, and it is not always consistent. So there's probably a lot of it that's actually very good, but there's also a lot that is of lower quality. And I think the other thing I'd say is that a lot of the issues are not necessarily that the information that you could glean from a system is wrong, but it's also what's not in there. For example, the detailed conditions are contained within a lease. So that might well be in a paper document somewhere, so a new system would assist us in just marshalling all of that data, so we can understand and interrogate it, and then if I have a lot more confidence that we're in a good place in terms of all of the arrangements we put in place.
I guess my concern is that with the constraints that the council has from a financial perspective, waiting for a system to manage data, we could never get there. And at the same time, we never managed our data. So what I'm asking is, have we got a plan to prioritize cleaning up the data at the very least with what we currently have?
So the property review, which is subject to the business case ongoing, splits into 3 distinct areas. One being data cleansing and data gathering, The second being the procurement of a property management system in which to store that data. And the third is around delivering improved policies and strategies for our property assets. So at the heart of it is that we need to prove our business case that cleansing and collating our data in a sensible way will help us going forward. What we're doing in the intervening period is prioritising events that happen through the property cycle. So where we've got contingent liabilities that have arisen or other sort of major reviews of different things, we will do that as and when and make sure that that data is stored in an appropriate way so that when hopefully we do manage to make the case for a new system and to review our property data, that exercise has already been done for that specific property and we can then move forward from that. So for us, it's about trying to about trying to make the best of what we have at the moment and keep continuously trying to improve our data. We are trying to flag things that we've reviewed and to make sure that we're not repeating that work. And we've got, it's death by trackers in the team at the moment, to be honest, but it's the only way we've got of having a systematic approach to our property issues.
I have Kathy, then I'll have Isidore, then Councillor Mason.
So when you're talking of your new system, I'm just envisaging the time it's going to take. So not only have you got to make a case for getting the new system, but it's then transferring everything that you've got to this new system. And I'm seeing years of, that's a really long-term project. So I'm hoping that a lot of this cleaning up data and trackers and such like is going to be productive in helping you manage the system going forward.
So you're right. It is it's not something that will be done quickly. And in the previous responses, I think some of the dates that we highlighted for when we'd expect things to be completed were in 2026. So we've always said that this was going to take a number of years. But as Sarah's indicated, there's a lot that we can do now, and we are doing it, and we're seeing good results from it as well.
Okay. Councillor Dagidis. Councillor Mason.
Thank you. I just wanted to, it's a different question, but it's about the fact that we've got quite a large number of voids to do with damp and mould and disrepair. And I want to know, one, how long we can now expect to wait until those voids are turned around, and how high, what kind of priority you're giving those so that we can get people, families who are now paying.
Councillor Mason. Councillor Mason, that's the next item on the agenda. If you could hold that, your
Okay,
question
well,
for
the
that
question then is about whether it's because of the damp and mould question.
So that's going to be on the next item on the
Okay,
agenda.
fine. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. So that's item 8. Yep.
Okay.
Okay. If there's no further questions, can I now invite Beverly Tarker to update on the management of AIDS and adaptation audit? Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Beverly Tarker, Director for Adults, Health and Communities. I'd also like to introduce the Service Director, Joe Batty, who will support in the verbal update. Good evening and thank you all. A report was prepared, but we've been asked to give a brief verbal update in terms of the progress against the recommendations. And this concerns the audit of occupational therapy, aids and adaptations. There were
Sorry for the interruption. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
David, if you can
Thank
continue,
you.
thank you.
the relevant audit areas were policies and procedures for the service, quality and effectiveness of the service, funding allocation and procurement of contractors. So there was one fundamental recommendation to do with procurement of contractors. And Joe will be pleased to take you through the progress we've made on that. And the other recommendations were priority twos. There were another 7 recommendations. So I will ask Joe to focus on the sort of significant recommendation and the progress we've made there, and then just to highlight the other recommendations, the progress that are being made in those regards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Beverly. Yes, so first of all, to the priority 1 fundamental recommendation was about the absence of documented process to award contracts, to award works to contractors. And in relation to that, we had a deadline of June 25, but we've made quite significant progress. So we're developing a call off within our dynamic purchasing system. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that, but it's a system that enables you to manage interest from various different providers in various different pieces we procure. So we'll create a competitive process to determine what suppliers can provide adaptations for the best value for money for the council. The specification is already in draft form and is nearing completion, and the pricing schedule is also developed. And once the procurement call-off process is complete, it will limit the number of providers that we use for adaptations, which will enable us to maintain quality in a stronger way. We expect to go out to the market in January and implement the call-off by the end of March 2025. So this action is partly completed. If I can just quickly go through the other 7, is that okay? I'll be brief. I know you've got a packed agenda. Other recommendations, which were priority 2, were consistent completion of occupational therapy assessments, which were not always fully evidenced. So since the audit, we've implemented a new case management system, and we've streamlined processes so that no referral can be made to the adaptations team without the sign-off of an OT assessment. Invoice approvals and reconciliation was not consistently retained or documented. Now invoices can't be approved without the sign-off of the adaptations team manager. And a spreadsheet is monitored and maintained so that we know exactly where we are in the process. Then on policy and procedures, which Bev referred to earlier, we were deemed to have an absence of an up-to-date and detailed policy and procedures within the service at the time. And the adaptations managers in the process of updating the policy against the national and local legislation, policy and guidance. Sorry, I failed to say that the deadline for all of the above is February 25, so we're making steady progress so far. Linking to that, there was a lack of awareness of the process to prioritise cases and to escalate adaptation cases. So we've already implemented a monitoring of waiting lists and the length of time that the occupational therapist and the surveyors are holding cases on their caseloads, so we can track more efficiently. We put a programme board in place to have some oversight and assurance as well. And since the audit, the waiting list has reduced, so that it's now at 60, which is a significant reduction in where we were at the time of the audit, when I think it was over 130 cases. We're monitoring progress in staff supervision as well, so that we can support our staff that are dealing with more complex cases, because quite a lot of the cases are quite complex, as you will know. And we're also having reflective practice as a team, excuse me, so that staff are grown and developed in their confidence in that area. The other area was around key performance indicators and follow-up from KPIs as well. So the board that I mentioned earlier has established KPIs for the adaptations team. And sorry, forgive me, since the audit, the waiting list, as I said earlier, is actually reduced from 220 to 60. And nearly there. Another area was incomplete processes, ensuring funding of aids and adaptations covers maintenance. And this area applies only to specialist equipment. We just clarified within the brief report we provide that warranties for specialist equipment are in place for 5 years if the resident lives in a council property. In the case of privately owned, rented or housing association tenants, at the end of this 5-year period, if the resident wishes to renew or update a warranty, they're responsible themselves for this extension. That's the difference between council tenants and private tenants. We were also asked to look more at monitoring of costs. And since the completion of the audit, the manager has in place a really good process to monitor and track costs, and this all reports into the programme board. We also use a panel to approve works over £30,000 to give that assurance and oversight of the more costly packages. And that's the end of my update. Thank you.
Thank you for your update. Any questions? Councillor Mason, then I got Councillor Isidore Tigidis, and then Adam. No? Okay.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. And that's good news. Glad to hear that the waiting list has gone so far down. That's brilliant. I just want to ask you about monitoring and tracking, particularly those cases that are difficult to either to gain entry to, or to speak to the right person to, or create some kind of difficulty for you, and how you are communicating with the tenants or the tenants representative, and whether those are the reason why quite a lot of cases get stuck. And just finally is that I just wanted to comment on the fact that the cases that we see as councillors are often those ones, and they create quite a lot of work for you and for us, and that's kind of wasted work. And I just want to know whether you think that there are better ways in which we can keep communication as light as possible when those cases come up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. That is absolutely spot on, that assessment of the situation. I think there are a couple of ideas that we have around the programme board and how we might involve a couple of community reps to strengthen our lens on what's working and what's not working so well. And I think that would be hugely helpful. I think in terms of the programme board's assurance and oversight, I think it would be good to think about how we link in some of the queries from the councillors, because we get quite a lot in this area, as you've just alluded to. And they're often in relation to residents that are dealing with multiple complexity. So their issues are not just around aids and adaptations, as you know. So I think we need to sweat that programme board, because it clearly has many functions usefully, informed by the audit. But I think the bit that we need to get better at is reducing emails which take up a lot of time and often involve a lot of churn, but don't necessarily get to the conclusion, the solution as quickly as they can. So I think that's the next stage. We need to use the programme board better, and definitely involve a little bit of external check and challenge from maybe a couple of our community groups who are well versed in this area themselves, for a range of reasons.
Thank you.
Councillor Tigidis.
Thank you. Well, I also got the gist of what you said and the director said, that we're making progress on the implementation. Problem is, I've got is that I'm not that well informed about your service in detail and everything like this, and I haven't had the chance to study it very much. Therefore, a lot of it is above my head. So can I just procedurally, though, I want to ask 3 questions. One question is, presumably you have briefed and discussed with your cabinet member, and is she satisfied with the progress you made? Is the first thing. The second thing is, I noticed certain things that are coming on all another issues about data and about reconciliations, etc. If I take reconciliations of your payments with the bank accounts and all that kind of thing, and is that just your responsibility? Isn't it the finance responsibility? We've got a partner in its department, and if it is, as I assume, can I ask the finance service to assure me? Are you satisfied that they are making progress in this department the way they should be, or do we need to do anything else? And overall, again, admitting that I'm not an expert in this particular area, are you, the head of audit, advising me that it's sufficient progress, or should we be shouting? Thank you.
There are questions for a couple of people, so can I ask you to respond, then move on?
Thank you, Councillor, for the questions. With regards to the briefing of the lead member, Councillor Desneves, I can confirm that she's regularly briefed on this area. As with, this particular area which receives limited assurance, it's incumbent on us to keep her regularly briefed of the progress being made, and that's been duly carried out. In terms of the she's assured that we are moving in the right direction. I don't know how she's feeling about it, whether it's happy, but I would use the word assured, if that's okay. In terms of reconciliation of payments, we've got a tiered authorization process within the service, and the sign-off of the adaptations team manager is required. And that's only given after the surveyor has inspected the works that have been carried out. So I would say that assurance in terms of invoice sign-off rests with the service. As to audit's role, I'll hand you over to Minesh. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. As highlighted by Beverly, that process is mainly done within the service, but that essentially it's adaptation. So it's usually capital spend. So finance would see the monitoring. So we work really closely with all of our services, including adult social care. So when we look at the monthly monitoring, we'll be looking at the spend coming through the finance system, looking at the forecast and working with the service. But in terms of the decision making and the direct reconciliation, that's all maintained within service. So just very quickly, I would say it was joint responsibility. So if I've got any concerns with any service, then I would raise it with directly with the service to gain that assurance. But it is that joint working. So lots of the decisions are taken within the service. So my assurance comes that those decisions are taken in line with the policies and processes that should happen. But any concerns that I've got, whether they come up through audit or just whether, across my radar, I would follow up directly with the service. Thanks.
Minesh, if you can just answer the assurance question, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so short answer is yes, Councillor Dikides. We have that follow-up arrangement where we'll, independent of the service, we'll give you an assurance level of where we think the recommendations lie. Just for clarity's sake, you're getting two levels of assurance here. You're getting assurances from the service directly, and then you'll get a second set of assurances from me independently.
Thank you so much, officers. So we conclude this part, the action tracker. So we will move on. Thank you so much. Thank you. So now we will move on to item 8. Can I now invite Jahid Rahman to introduce the report of the housing audit? Okay, so thank you.
Afternoon, Jadal Rahman, Operational Director for Housing Service. The report in front of you provides the committee an update into 3 areas of audit that was taking place between July and August that received limited assurance for Housing Service. Those 3 areas are focused on the right to buy process, tenancy management, and damp and mould. On the right to buy, the areas that were reviewed were policies, procedures, and inquiry response times, assessment of right to buy applications, compliance with right to buy requirements, discounts on sales, cost floor calculations, money laundering training, sales receipt, and notification of buybacks. So the report made 3 recommendations, one of which was fundamental and 2 were housekeeping. With regards to the fundamental recommendation, there was a delayed section 125. So just by way of background, whenever a tenant makes an application for right to buy, they would complete a RTB1. We would then have a time period to notify the tenant if the right to buy application has been accepted or not. If it has been accepted, within 12 weeks, would be required to issue a section 125 that confirms the property valuation and discount available. At the time when this audit was done, there was a backlog of just over 40 evaluations that hadn't been done, which then in turn resulted in us unable to issue the section 125. The valuation itself is not done by housing itself, it's done by the corporate property team who then outsource that piece of work. I'm happy to report since the audit that backlog has been cleared, but it's worth members to bear in mind, given the recent policy change in right to buy discount, the discount reverts now back to 16,000. So applicants had up until 21st of November to make an application to qualify for the old discount. We received just over 700 applications. So whilst we've cleared the backlog of section 125s, we do have a lot more to process in terms of new applications, and potentially we may have a backlog of more section 125s. Both the leasehold team as well as the valuation team are reviewing all of the applications we've received, looking at how we can resource it to ensure the statutory timescales can be met. The 2 housekeeping ones, one was around the right to buy policy, where one of the officers forwarded over the out-of-date right to buy policy to the auditors. However, there was a more recent one that hadn't been passed over to the auditor. So there was a recommendation around version control. Happy to take questions on the leasehold and right to buy.
Thank you very much. Sorry, just on the 700 applications on the right to buy, can you give some kind of comparative figure to what you would have expected normally in that time, please?
For the last 3 years, on average, we receive around 250 applications for right to buy per year. So the 700 is probably about 3-4 years worth of right to buy applications received in a space of about 3 weeks. I would say, again, the pattern is not specific to Harrogate. I've spoken to other directors, and some of them have received applications worth 10 years or more. Most people are trying to get their application in to get qualified for the old discount. We've taken a very sort of strict approach. We would consider all applications received up until the 21st of November. If there's been an error on the way they've completed the form, would give the tenant another 5 days to correct the error. And if they don't comply within 5 days, then that won't be considered for the new discount.
What's the current capacity within your team to deal with that kind of massive applications coming in?
So statutory wise, we're required to issue section 125s within 12 weeks from the point we've accepted the right to buy application. So ordinarily we would need to issue the section 125 within 12 weeks. if we're not able to issue the Section 125 within 12 weeks and they do complete the sale, the resident can ask for a deduction on their rent should they proceed to complete and we hadn't completed on time. At the moment, we're confident. We have recruited additional staff to help with the influx of applications we received to be able to meet the demand that's come through. And we are working with our valuations team to make sure on their side they've got sufficient surveyor capacity to be able to value those properties within the timescale set out as well.
Thank you. Councillor Mason.
Thank you. And just to follow on from that, that we are of course all aware that this is an area where fraud is fairly rife. And so an increase in the numbers of applications, a percentage of those are going to be fraudulent. Do you know what percentage you were working on previously and how you can relate that to the number of increases and therefore how we deal with this potential problem of fraud?
So the audit did pick up the fraud checks for right to buy application. So when we receive a right to buy application, before we accept the application, that application is passed to our internal fraud team, which is Minish and Vanessa's team. They've got someone independent in their team that carry out the financial checks of that person, and if need be, may follow up with further lines of inquiry if there's any case of concerns. There was a housekeeping recommendation made. The audit recognised significant due diligence has been done around minimising fraud for right to buy, but a housekeeping recommendation was made to make sure that information, whilst it's captured, is saved centrally, whereas at the time of the audit, it was saved locally in someone's sort of personal drive. But in terms of the process itself and the checks, that was fine.
Thank you. It's just, yeah, follow up, if that's okay. It's just to ask the audit team, so have you had an increase in amount of work and are you due to this, and have you got the resources in place?
The increase hasn't quite hit us yet. It will. And we've had one meeting already to sort of plan and look at how that works. I've reached out to the head of service in Charheads area, and we will have a conversation about what that looks like. But yeah, as long as we apply our sort of rigor checks, a number of applications drop out through, and in the main, it's about half of FTE that works on the sort of money laundering and the rights buy. So we've got a bit of capacity. We've sort of planned that if he needs some extra hands, then that will be available. And obviously it's reasonably time limited because we're expecting this to drop off once the sort of the lower discount applies. So it's sort of peaking work, but it will then sort of trail off at some point.
Thank you, Vanessa. Councillor Ahmed.
And
Those- Yep.
Yeah,
go.
and just a question, if well, hopefully we make the deadline, but in the event that we don't and some properties do fall off, have you guys discussed with the government of a potential grace period, or would the properties just not get the predated discount?
So we had a look at the guideline, and it said the time period to qualify for the old discount is the 21st of November. They didn't say specifically what you would do after 21st of November and what grace period you use. So we've taken a view. We would take 21st of November plus 5 days. So anything received after 21st of November plus 5 days, they wouldn't be eligible for the old discount. They'd be eligible for the new discount, which is 16,000. However, if we received an application by the 21st of November and there was an error made on the application, we'd also equally give that 5 days to correct the error made. Because often, in order to secure the discount, whilst tenants may not have the ability to buy in the next 12 months, they put an application in to secure the discount. So not many may actually complete, but we still want to make sure where someone has made an application and it's been made incorrectly, we give them the opportunity to correct the application rather than say no.
Just to clarify, as long as the tenant makes the application before the 21st or within the 5 days grace period, whatever happens with our processing, they'll still get the previous discount.
Yeah, so if they've had an application prior to the 21st of November, that would still be a live application and they would receive the old discount. If they made an application on the 21st of November, they'll still get the old discount. Any applications received after 21st of November plus 5 days would be not eligible for the old discount, but only eligible for the new limited 16,000 discount.
So is that okay, Ahmed? So short one, please.
Yes.
Yep.
Just a comment on that one, which implies a question. It's a common thing for local government of various things when we are stressed out with being sticklers for procedures. So if you haven't put the right word in the right place, then throw it to us, and then it hasn't started get counting and all that kind of thing, which is fine, except in cases like this where you might lose the grant in the end. It's not just a delay. So I just wanted to make your reassurance that we are helping people to fill the forms properly, to know what's going on, and we're not abusing that process. And one little additional question, I noticed in the external auditors report for 2021-22, a reference to the valuations. And I don't know whether it's absolutely directly relevant to this particular issue, but it says we were criticized that our valuations haven't been very accurate. You know, that if I put it that way. So is there a problem there around there that causes your section a particular problem? Thank you.
The audit did look at the valuation and the methodology. There wasn't any concerns raised around the accuracy of the valuation. The only concern that was raised was the backlog of valuations that we had at the time, which was over 40. But that backlog has been cleared. Those 40 evaluations has been done. Partially, the reason for the delay was there was one surveyor used by the corporate property team who went off on sick, and that caused that backlog to build up. Since then, we've got the internal capacity plus externally, we've got another valuer. So even if you've got a single point of failure, you've got that external capacity to do the valuation. And again, no concerns were raised regarding recent valuations that have been done, whether it's too high or below. Equally, under the right to buy process, as a tenant, if you receive a valuation, you can appeal that valuation, and subject to that appeal, that could confirm the original valuation. It could confirm a higher valuation or a lower valuation. So again, there are processes in place if the tenant's not happy with the valuation, a way for them to appeal that valuation.
Thank you. You want to continue with the rest of the items on your report? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So the second audit that was done was on tenancy management. There were 0 fundamental recommendations, 5 significant, and 2 housekeeping. The key one around the significant significant recommendation was around the completion of tenancy audits. As a landlord, what we've agreed to do is undertake 100% tenancy audits every 5 years. So effectively, we would try and visit every single one of our homes 20% each year. So just over 3,000 is our target to do tenancy audits each year. So by the 5th year, we would have done tenancy audits on all 15,000 of our properties. At the time when the audit was done, 1,400 was achieved against a target of 3,000. And that was primarily due to the service being only half of what the establishment post needed to be. Since then, there has been a massive recruitment drive and the individuals are in post. So we should be achieving 3,000 tenancy audits each year. There was a further recommendation made around the way tenancy audits are done. So at the moment, we've got quite a sophisticated algorithm that determines how we target properties for tenancy audits. So the algorithm consists of looking at rent accounts starring credits, looking at tenants who've made payments for the rent out of borough. It looks at tenants who've never reported a repair. So a number of factors are taken into account as part of the algorithm that then pushes for that property to be identified as a tenancy audit, and housing officers would visit that property to carry out a number of checks to make sure the person who we think is living there is living there. Part of the recommendation made as part of the audit was to have a more of a streamlined approach. So whilst the algorithm is there, to also look at other ways of identifying potential fraud and how those referrals are received and how that's acted on. So I think there was a wider piece of work from the audit where the auditors felt, given that there's a fairly new workforce within the establishment, for the audit team to actually do some tenancy audit training, so that I understand both the heads of services for tenancy management as well as audit have been in discussion to roll that training out, so housing officers can identify more easily potential fraud and how those referrals take place. Have to take questions around tenancy.
Thank you very much. Just on the completion of the tenancy audits with the 2 out of 3 visiting officers that have been recruited, are you still expecting to recruit the third, or is that part of the hiring freeze?
The third has now been recruited yet.
My understanding that the tenancy audit visits are sort of ad hoc, unplanned, so people don't know they're coming.
Yes, that's correct. So at the beginning of each financial year, we'd earmark 3,000 properties. Within that 3,000, a large proportion of it would be made up of the algorithm I mentioned that gives us an indicator of where we think fraud might be taking place. One of the things that we don't want to do is, just do random visits without any sort of evidence behind it. So we think if we've got data that supports a reason for that audit to take place, we're far more likely to identify fraud rather than a random visit without any information. So the algorithm gives us a starting point, but ultimately the housing officers need to visit the property, get access to the property, look at who's living in the property, speak to the neighbours to ascertain whether there is any fraud taking place or not.
What's looking at the percentage of fraud that you've unearthed previously? What's your expectation per annum in terms of fraud, and what processes do you follow in order to rectify that?
Question for Vanessa or Minish. Yeah.
Going to have anti-fraud corruption progress report, which is item 10. But if you can just literally, if you can hold that question for that item, that would be better. Thank you.
Yeah, just I noticed that you referred to 5 significant recommendations here, but in the actual report you're referring to 4. So you only refer to completion of tenants audits, the management about fraud related, then the training, the wider one, and the management of
What I need is just for the records of the minutes. If you can speak to the mic, it's better to capture your question better.
Yeah. So just is there one more missing here? It's in the editing or whatever.
So the 5 key areas are completion of tenancy audit, fraud related audits that are not triggered for completion. Training is the third one. The fourth is policies and procedures. And the fifth one is data integrity checks. One of the recommendations made on the data integrity was we should be checking the data that we hold for tenants with regular spot checks. So again, when we do tenancy audits, whilst one of the drivers is to make sure we maximize information we hold against the tenant and to make sure they're living there, also using that opportunity to maximize information we've got in the household. So that was part of the recommendation around building up the data that we've got for our tenants when we do the tenancy audits.
Get full assurance in the next audit we do in this area about these areas.
Yeah, so because the audits were predominantly done between July and August, a number of recommendations are not currently due yet. Most are due at some point next year. So where we have been able to progress it, that is the progress the moment. But by all means, happy to provide a more fuller update once all of those due dates are. Yeah.
You want to move on to the damper mold?
On the damper mold audit, so the audit recognised a number of work that's happened over the last 2 years, including setting up a dedicated damper mold team, having a dedicated damper mold policy, and then also the team moving away from manually recording damper mold cases to a more automated system. One of the recommendations, which is quite significant, was around data reconciliation. So when the team set up the damper mold team just over 2 years ago, the way the team recorded data was through a manual spreadsheet. And over the last year, it was quite important for us. We get the team to move away from a spreadsheet and to a type of system. So we made a decision last year to build a damper mold CRM system. So at the time when the audit was done, data was held on two parts of the system. One was on the CRM system that's been developed internally, and the old data was held on the spreadsheet. So there was a wider recommendation made to try and integrate all of those two data sets into one. The issue we've got is with the new CRM data set, with any new referrals that we receive, there's around 10 questions that we obtain from the tenants to make sure that we've got all of the information we need before that's logged as a live damper mold case. And that could include understanding who's living in the property, do they have any medical issues, how many children do they have in the property, do they have any medical issues. The historic data doesn't have that extensive level of information, which we didn't capture at the time. At the time, it was, you have damper mold, that's fine. We'll book an appointment. We'll get Severa to check it. So it's not as simple as trying to consolidate the two data sets. So what we've accepted is all new damper mold cases do go for a very stringent process of questioning, data gathering, whereas some of the earlier data that we got last year, unless we go back to those residents and get that information, it's not as simple to reconcile.
So Small, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering about the damper mold case management system, whether the new management system are cases logged sort of individually as if they exist in and of themselves, or are individual cases built up per property to sort of get a historical look at what's going on? Because I know in the root cause analysis section, it talks about identifying the risk of recurrence, and it notes that they're either picked up by responsive repairs, or if more complex works are required, they're passed to a contractor to remedy. I'm sure councillors will have examples of, well, unless you sort of knock the building down or completely rebuild it, it's going to keep coming back. And obviously the service will face financial pressures. So there must be ongoing long cases. What are we doing to sort of monitor that? And that also ties into the tenants' feedback. How much are we sort of building up for tenants that are having recurring issues again and again, the sort of storytelling element of this person has been suffering with this now for 5 or 6 years, where it keeps repeating. So we have that qualitative data as well to feed into the system.
So in terms of the system, phase 1 has been completed, which is at the moment it's a standalone damper mold system. It enables officers to capture key essential household information before it's logged as a live damper mold system. Phase 2 is currently being worked on for that to be implemented, and phase 2 is the actual integration of this new system that we built with our property management system. So they're all talking to each other. So you've got the damper mold system, the property management system the council will use, as well as some of the people information, and phase 2 will integrate all of those 3 areas together so we can get a fuller view. Phase 2 is still work in progress. However, we are also aware a large proportion of our legal disrepair cases are damper mold, and part of the recommendation within this audit was to make sure we're cross-referencing the new damper mold cases that we've got with our legal disrepair cases where it's been reported as damper mold. So that data sharing exercise is taking place. That's already been done without waiting for the phase two system migration to take place. That's been manually done. In terms of reoccurring themes, there are some properties where we can go in and do a damp and mold wash where we expect the damp and mold to return. So we are looking at piloting sensors and putting those sensors in the property that would then give us real-time data around the way the household is using the property, how often are they putting the heating on, is there enough humidity in the property. So that's still a pilot at the moment, and for properties where we feel the damp and mold may return, we'll be piloting the sensors to get a more of a fuller view. The reality is, a large proportion of our stock were built, before 1934. They are old stock. We do have old roofs that need to be fully replaced rather than repaired. So the challenges are quite complex to tackle damp and mold in social housing in Haringey. So where it's been reported, what we do is we triage it. So essentially, if we feel it's a category 1 damp and mold, and our surveyors have gone out and inspected it, we would ordinarily do a temporary decant. So we'd ask the family to move out temporarily whilst we carry out the remedial work. And that would be done in the most extreme cases of damp and mold. But again, that would only be a temporary decant. Once the works are complete, the family would be expected to move back in. For category 2 damp and mold, we wouldn't do a temporary decant, but we'd do the work on site. And again, our surveyors would go out, look at what works need to be done, specify the works, and then get the works organised.
So Mason?
Thank you. A couple of things I wanted to ask you about. One was the link between damp and mould and voids has been ongoing for quite a long time. I know in Bounds Green, I've just in the last week, I've picked up 4 cases where there are voids for over a year, which are related to damp and mould. So I'd just like to ask about that and how much of a priority it is to get those back in stock. And the second question is communication with residents and tenants. So quite often people will say, oh, they came round and looked at it and said it was my fault for not opening the window or something. And so it creates this difficulty between people who feel they're being blamed, and actually it's not true, it's that, where it might be. And it doesn't really solve the issue because they just feel they're bad. So I just wanted to know about, in terms of communication with tenants, whether there is a prevention strategy in place around damp and mould and whether that is working. Thank you.
I think one of the things that we try and do, and it was a recommendation from the Housing Ombudsman's report, as well as the case findings from our Bishak's case, not to blame tenant lifestyle. What we do try and encourage residents to do is, to heat their home properly. And if they're under financial difficulty where they're trying to control how much they spend, to contact our financial inclusion team. Ultimately, what we found, and I've mentioned, this case before, there was a particular family that was mentioned in a documentary done last year, and they had damp and mold. When I visited the property, you had a couple with 3 sets of twins living in 1-bedroom property. As I walked in, you could feel the moisture and condensation in the property, and the property was significantly overcrowded. So we can try and advise and give guidance to residents, but there are complex issues in Haringey where, in some cases, families do need to be rehoused. Unfortunately, we've got a shortage of supply and a high level of overcrowdedness. But more generally, I think where there is a repair that needs to be done or a mold wash, we would do that work just to try and remove the immediate risk for the household. So we've got void standards. So when we do turn around void properties, we wouldn't be letting those properties, if they've got high levels of damp and mold, we wouldn't be letting those properties out. But equally, sometimes with houses particularly, you may have water penetration from the roof causing some damp and mold. So we'd have to do the roof work first before we do the internal work. And sometimes that can take a lot more because you're doing work to the roof rather than just the internal of the property.
You got follow-up, Councillor Mason?
Yeah, I am really concerned about this because I know houses and flats just in my local area. And as I said, I've just in the last week, I've been to 4. And so are we turning around those void properties quicker than we used to? Why have they been left for a year when clearly we've got homeless families who need those properties?
Yeah, so when we developed the housing improvement plan over a year and a half ago, we had just over 550 voids. The housing improvement plan focused on tackling the void backlog, which the team did last year. So our HRA business plan assumes we'll have a void rate of 2% this year, so around 300 voids. So it's on average, we should be aiming to have no more than 150 voids per year. We're currently around 2%. We're hoping to return back to 1% by March 2025. We've had a higher level of void this year in comparison to previous years. So as year to date, we've had about 350 new voids come through from March till now. So we are working through all of those voids coming through, partially because of the neighbourhood move scheme. So when you've got families that get offered new build properties, you've got particular estates where we will receive 70, 80 voids within 3 to 4 weeks because all of those families have been offered new build properties and those are becoming vacant and they're all coming in at once. So part of it is policy, part of it is often you would expect a general churn of about 350 to 400 voids each year, considering our stock size.
Thank you. So I have Reyes.
I'm seeing a similar issue, and correct me if I'm wrong, around about potential data issues in the service, and if that's right, do we have a deliberate plan to firstly correct the data, identify where our data sits in, etc. It's similar to the commercial property service. Are we collaborating in a way to share best practice on how we go about doing this?
So the data issues in relation to the damp and mold. So I think the position we've accepted is the data that we collected on. Right. Would you want to be a bit more specific?
So we were mentioning that we're doing the audits to update our data.
Yeah.
So for me, that implies that we have a potential data integrity issue, or the data is not up to date or complete.
No, so on the audits, the issue isn't about data integrity. The issue was around capacity. So we are required to do around 3,000 audits a year. The team did 1,400. The reason why they didn't do the 3,000 was because they had a team half the size. So if they were a full complement of staff, the expectation would have been that they completed 3,000 audits. So the issue there isn't, data, it's more around capacity. The issue around data is around damp and mold, and it's partially based on the way the team initially collected the information, which was manual, to how they're collecting the information now, which is very streamlined and in a lot more detail. In order to collect the same level of data for the old cases, it does mean going back to the old tenants and asking for new data sets that we've not asked them for before. And we've taken a view, if those damp and mold referrals have been done and dealt with, all new cases that we deal with will collect through the new methodology. Old cases, if they're closed and the tenants are happy, would put that as a closure and not reopen that particular case to collect more data on.
Benny?
Chair. So just 2 questions from myself, if that's okay. One is you referenced that through the implementation of the new system that you've been able to achieve quicker resolutions, and I was just wondering if you could kind of quantify that from a time perspective. And then the second question that I had was on the specific wash treatment that you refer to, is that a single kind of application, or do you apply that sort of multiple times before you escalate it for more significant repairs?
If I take your last question first, so the mold wash we'd ordinarily do when we go and do a survey. If there's damp and mold, if it's a category damp, damp and mold would offer a mold wash to see if that rectifies the problem. In some cases it does. In other cases, we do need to go back and offer another mold wash. Sometimes we need to do more invasive treatment, like dealing with cold bridging, where you've got effectively a cold space between the exterior of the building and the interior of the building, and you need to insulate it. So depending on the type of damp and mold, we would then apply the relevant remedy. But the immediate thing that we would ordinarily do is do the damp and mold wash, because we can do it there and then. It removes the immediate risk whilst we work to schedule in the more complex long-term work.
Okay, thank you. And then the first question around the time.
On the system, so it's only partially built. So we're looking at phase 2, which will look at the integration with our existing system. Once that's done, that will give us a fuller view of all of the information we've got against the property of the person for that particular damp and mold case.
So just to clarify, so when we're saying it's a quicker resolution, are we actually getting to a resolution quicker? I guess is.
I wouldn't say it's a quicker resolution. What I would say is it's more accurate reporting and recording of the progress. So when you try and case manage a damp and mold through spreadsheets, for example, it's very difficult to work out and track, has an appointment been made? Has a surveyor gone out? What were the findings of the surveyors? From that, has the works been scheduled in? Whereas for a CRM system, it's a lot more easy to track the progress.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jared. And thank you, Councillor Williamson, for coming in. Okay, thank you. Now we'll move on to item 8. Update, sorry. Item 7, the value for money. So we have to note the recommendation for item 8. Now we move on to the item 7. Value for a money assessment to 31st of March 2003 BDO.
Sorry, Chair, could it just be noted that part of this report was only received by members of the committee about 2.5 hours before the committee commenced this evening, and it was about an additional 60 pages or so, which I can only speak for myself, but definitely did not have time to look at in that time.
Okay, thank you. That's a really valid point. Yes.
Similar comments, a lot of documentation, not just for this item, for other as well, being received in the last 4 days, so from the weekend onwards. So if we could improve, because members have very difficult task to give the due attention.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We'll make our utmost for the future meetings to receive reports on time. Thank you for those valuable comments. So item 7, now can I now invite external auditor Rachel Britton to introduce the report?
Thank you, Chair. So appreciate that there is a lot of documentation on this item, and what I will do is I won't go through every single report, you'll be pleased to know, but essentially they all follow a very similar template. So actually, once you've read one, the other 5 are very similar, if not identical, apart from the years. So I appreciate there is a lot of volume, but hopefully what I could do is just take you through the key messages, and then we can get to a point where you can ask questions and I can clarify anything that you didn't get the opportunity to read through. And the reason that we have had to push it to go through this committee is because this is the last committee before the 13th of December, which is the final date that we get to do these things. So we do have a pressure on our time. So essentially, I know it's badged as value for money, but there's a bit more in terms of that, because this is the item that we need to consider to sign off the remaining financial statements for the 2021, 21-22 and 22-23 financial years. As I'm sure you're all aware, there is a significant delay in local authority audits happening, and currently there's around 750 outstanding audit reports across the country. As a result of that, the government has put in a number of measures to address this and get back to a position of timely financial reporting and assurance, so that you can be back on track in a normal cycle where you're looking at the year of audit that has just happened. In order to do that, they have put in what they're calling a backstop date, which for all years up until 22-23 is the 13th of December 24. And that is what I'll take you through tonight. So you have 7 reports from us tonight. As I said, they're all very similar. They follow the same template. So I'll just draw out the key messages. The 3 that were received late this afternoon, apologies for that. There was a confusion about whether, because these were pension fund reports, whether they would come here or go to a different committee. But these are the reports in relation to the pension fund financial statements. There is 1 audit completion report for 2021 and 2 combined planning and completion reports for 21-22 and 22-23. As you will note from these reports, we are concluding that we have not, with the imposition of the backstop date, we have not had time to complete these engagements, and we have done no audit procedures on these audits. So essentially proposing disclaimed opinions for those 3 years for the pension fund. Disclaimed opinion, yeah. The other 3 reports you have are in relation to the council financial statements, completion reports. Again, we are concluding that we have, because of the imposition of the backstop date, we have not had time to complete our audit procedures for these years. And again, we'll be proposing a disclaimer opinion for the council's financial statements for those years also. There are, however, 2 things that I just wanted to draw to your attention, which are on page 8 of the report. The first one is in relation to infrastructure assets accounting. And there was a new statutory instrument that came into effect to undo some complexities around the infrastructure accounting and give you an opportunity or an option to not report gross costs and accumulated depreciation in relation to those assets. And from looking at the financial statements, this has not been applied to 22-23. So there's currently not consistency between those financial statements. Ultimately, it doesn't really make any difference because I'm not given any assurance on those financial statements anyway, but just to draw that out, because if you compared all of those sets of financial statements, it would potentially look odd. And the second one is in relation to the car park debtor. So the council changed its system in 2021, and as a result, the information held on the previous system could not be obtained and provided. Again, we have done no audit procedures, so it doesn't impact in relation to that because we aren't testing that balance. But just to draw it to your attention, because we do know that potentially when your subsequent auditors come and try to do this, they will have issues trying to verify that balance and the corresponding provision for that balance as well. So my responsibility is that I have to draw out potential material issues, and those are the 2 that I have identified. So as I said, 6 opinions, 6 disclaimer opinions for the years to get you up to 22-23, and then your new auditors will take over for 23-24 and be able to issue their opinion in February. So in order to progress in terms of the financial statements, the final financial statements will need to be approved, or a delegation to the section 151 and the chair to approve any final changes to enable those to be approved, and then I can issue the opinions on those. Slight caveat to that is that I also have 3 objections to the financial statements, which I'm in the process of determining. We do hope to conclude these or get to a position to conclude that they are not material in the next couple of days. So it shouldn't prevent me from issuing the opinions, but just to flag that if we do consider that to be a potentially material issue, that is one of the exceptions in the regulations that prevents me from being able to issue those opinions. But hopefully we'll get to a position that that is not the case. So the final report that you have is the value for money report, which concludes our responsibilities around value for money and whether the council has adequate arrangements in place to secure value for money. The code was also revised in relation to our responsibilities for value for money, and as such we are only required to consider 2 criteria, which are financial sustainability and governance for these years. And normally we would do an auditor's annual report for each year, but again these regulations have said that we can combine that, given where we are and the fact that it's a historical position, into one report. So that's the report that you have covering all of those 3 years. We've not identified any significant weaknesses in arrangements for the council up until the 31st of March. However, we have flagged in those reports the ongoing challenging financial position that council faces, especially in relation to savings and the use of reserves, and would recommend that the council continues to have robust assessment and monitoring of the financial position to make sure that there's that future look and the financial sustainability is there for the future years over the medium term. So that was all I was proposing to say, but very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rachel. So questions? So Councillor Diaguides?
I haven't read the reports. I haven't seen them. I haven't got them at this moment in time, but it's enough from what you said to get me very, very worried at this moment in time. There is a question which probably our the Director of Finance might answer better, but what happens, because you're talking about, and from the little, yeah, you're talking about, and from the little I've seen of the final report, which I had received it online and I read the first few pages, you're referring to a lot of times about the backstop date and not having time and therefore a qualified. So all these accounts for the 21, 22, 22, 23 will be qualified by definition because of all these questions that you leave open. Where does that leave us? For example, I just want to know what the implications of that are for family council. As such is one of the key. Can I just register that, and I might come back for one more question, but later, Chair.
You want to respond to that, Rachel? Thank you.
Sure. So the disclaimer opinion that I will give will state that there is no assurance over the balances within those years. So what will happen is, I think it's KPMG, is it your new auditor, KPMG, have done, are undertaking an audit for the 23-24 financial year. As part of that audit, they will do their normal audit, and they will be able to get assurance over the closing balances for your 24 financial year. There is likely to be some form of modification of their opinion. Obviously, I can't speak for them because they are a different auditor to me, but there are lots of guidance in place. So when the government did this, they set out some recovery guidance, so building back to full assurance. And essentially, because of the way accounts work, the opening balances will still have questions, and there will probably be some form of qualification modification over the opening balances, but the closing balances you should be able to get comfortable with. And then the following year, you'll be able to build on that again, because the closing balances become the opening balances, and it will take probably 2 years to get back to a clean opinion position.
I mean, I would want a bit more explanation from our own officers, basically, about the implications. But can I ask, you referred to the three objections you received. Can you tell us what they are?
So there was one in relation to the purchase of a site. I'm struggling to remember the name of it. Is it Woodside? Is it Woodside? Yeah. So, and that the council has undertaken a full investigation into that. So that is cleared. And the other two are around PCNs, parking charges notices. So yeah, those are the issues.
You want to just come in for Councillor Diaguides' question about assurances?
Yes, I mean,
I think it's a question we come back to in the January meeting when KPMG present their findings and their opinion, and they'll be able to give us an idea about the assurance on the closing balances, but also they'll hopefully be able to give us an indication of, as Rachel implied, it tends to be 2 to 3 years before you would get full assurance. But I think that's a question we come back and ask KPMG. They are very actively still doing their field work, so I wouldn't want to comment in terms of any findings at this stage. I mean, it is really challenging. I mean, I think we probably knew as a sector probably 9-10 months ago that lots of local authorities were going to be in this position, and therefore it would take that number of years for us to get that full assurance. But what I would say is, and I'm kind of looking at Rachel in terms of definition, in that a disclaimed set of accounts is slightly different to a qualified set of accounts, in that almost essentially a disclaimed set is we just haven't undertaken the work, rather than a qualified set is where usually the detailed work has been undertaken and then some fundamental issues with the account. So it's not an ideal position to be in, councillor, but we've almost got to ride through this process now, but hopefully over the next 2 to 3 years. But let's raise that question with KPMG once they've completed their field work, and they'll be able to give us a better indication.
All I'm worried about is, should I be worried? If I put it that way. I mean, at this moment in time, yeah, at this moment in time, are we sort of like, okay, there's nothing, no reason to panic, no reason for, especially us as the councillors, to do anything extra at this moment in time? Should we be prepared for something big, or is everything okay, containable at this moment in time as far as
I really don't want to preempt the findings by KPMG, and we should recognise is that is the first full audit that the council has been through for 3 years now. So I really, there are lots of hurdles, I think, kind of we just need to work through over the next couple of months. I suppose the direct answer to your question is, sat here on the 3rd of December, there's nothing that I feel I need to tell you at this point in time based on what Rachel's updated on. But as I say, that work by KPMG is absolutely still underway. So, I can't give you any concrete assurance, but what I can say to you is, from my perspective, there's nothing I feel that I need to urgently report to you today.
Thank you. Res?
Thanks, Rachel. Just a quick one related to the objection. You mentioned that if they are material, you'll not be able to issue your opinion. What is the implication for the council in that regard?
So within the guidance that was issued, there are some exemptions. They are whether you have a material objection to the financial statements, or there is any indication of non-compliance with laws and regulations. And they are the two only exemptions to not signing by the 13th of December. In that case, if that is the position we get to, and I very much hope that it isn't, the council has to publish a notification on their website to say why it wasn't done by the 13th of December, and then we have to complete it as quickly as possible after that date.
So just for clarity, it's not that you don't issue an opinion, you just have more time to issue.
Yes, yeah. So you need to fully investigate and resolve that potential material issue before you can issue the opinion on the financial statements.
Thank you. Councillor Small.
Excuse me, coughed down the microphone, apologies. There are just a few questions. There are a few bits within the report. On page 127, there's a sentence that's incomplete, it's not complete, that I just wanted to check with you, please. Oh, no, okay, yeah, I don't have the latest, so maybe I can just clarify this afterwards, but it's around the governance. It just says unable to satisfy ourselves, and then the sentence ends. No, I can highlight afterwards. Great, thank you. I just want to check what we're unable to satisfy ourselves about. And likewise for the overview of risks for the year ending March 2023, and I think year ending 2022, the audit risks. 1 to 4 are noted for the council and for Alexandra Park and Alexandra Huswood Green. There's nothing noted for Homes for Haringey, but there's also an additional risk, which is the revenue recognition. But it doesn't, I don't quite understand what that aligns to at the minute. And finally, no, not finally, two more. Just to clarify on the objections that may come and our role in the committee. So whether, I know there's the management representation letter, which we sign off with the chair's signature and so on. Are we signing that off whatever the potential objections come, or does that affect that sign off of that? And finally, Taryn, more a question for you, considering that the audit hasn't been completed or not as expected, has that made any adjustment to the fees, the payment of the services that have been used? I'm sure that's set out in the contracts and laws as well, but it'd be just useful to know. Thank you.
Shall I come back on the latter two? And then, yeah. So in terms of the sign off, so we'll hear all the questions today. So we've got 10 days till the 13th. A lot can happen in 10 days in the world of audit. So we will be very, 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 trying really hard to get those objections resolved by the 13th. We ideally don't want to publish that notice on the website. I understand we've now provided everything that we need, and it's just going through some internal checks at BDO. So we'll work on the assumption that we'll get that resolved by the 13th. I suppose what we were asking for tonight in terms of sign off is delegation to myself and the chair to sign that letter of representation, and maybe the chair and I will discuss if there is anything of significant change between what you see tonight and what then eventually is the final set. Then we will probably want to bring that back to the committee. Now, we won't be able to bring it back to a formal committee like tonight, but we will, of course, we can do that via email. So I think there will be a bit of a judgment call. So that's the assurance I'll give you tonight. If there's anything we think that's of significance, we will highlight that to the committee before we sign that management letter. In terms of the audit fees, it's a really difficult one. So fees are agreed by an organisation called PSSA. I always get the letters wrong. PSSA. But for me, I just want us to complete this process, and then we will have that discussion with PSSA in terms of the work that was undertaken over the last 3 years.
And yeah, with the other 2 points, if you let me know where they are, I can correct them for the final version. But there's nothing that I haven't been able to satisfy myself with, so I'm comfortable that that is a typo.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just in terms of the last point you were making about significant changes, and you'd come back to the committee, I'd quite like to know of any changes. Obviously, if they're just typos, no, but anything, because I do feel that this is an area not just in terms of actual materiality, there's also an issue of reputational damage and harm, and there will be people who will be looking at this and saying, oh, that's Haringey for you, and we don't want that. So I think that, so if there are any changes, I think it's important that we can support our chairs and our officers by knowing that everything has been transparent and upfront. So thank you for that. I suppose the second thing is, can we be reassured that the audits that were carried out in those years, that any recommendations were carried forward and acted on each year? I'm assuming they were, but I'd just like to have that written down.
If I come back to the first one around any changes, if the chair is comfortable, we can certainly, before we sign that letter on the 13th or before the 13th, we will do an email round to the committee just to preview, even if it's just to say no changes or just typo changes. If that is the chair's comfortable with that. In terms of any recommendations, I'm kind of looking at colleagues to my left and Rachel to my right in terms of were there any specific recommendations that came out in those 3 years that we want to give some assurance that we've carried forward?
So within the 2021 council report, we have put some recommendations in relation to our IT general controls, because that work was completed as part of our planning. Those recommendations came out of that. So they are in there. They don't currently have management responses, but obviously given where we are and the change of auditor, we haven't followed those up. But I think, again, I don't want to speak for KPMG, but they will have their own processes in relation to how they undertake their audit. So I think probably something for the council to be aware of, those recommendations, and KPMG, we will have to hand over to KPMG and tell them about those, but they may not follow them up in the same way.
Yeah, Chair, can I come? Yeah, thanks. Yes, Rachel is quite right. There were some recommendations on the IT processes that was picked up as part of the 2020-2021 accounts. And we have, in fact, during the audit, because as you know, that audit was so protracted, it's about 2 years audit, those recommendations, the ones that we have responded to, we have put in place, we've put things in place to deal with. And hopefully, when you see the report from KPMG, you observe, if you have to track back to this, you observe that some of those, or maybe all of them, will not actually resurface in KPMG's recommendations. So, yeah, and I think that's about it, really, because the audit wasn't really completed. So maybe there were a few other areas that would have come up, but for now, that's just it. It's been.
Final question, we're going to wrap up on this. Okay, so Councillor Isidoros.
On the follow-ups issue, and you refer to the IT, and for the little bit I've been looking now in my phone, etc., there are a lot of references to IT failures, some ridiculous ones about passwords and things like this, and some a bit more serious about transfer of data to new systems and delays and everything like this. And again, I mean, your advice to us, you know, how serious it is. The other area where I think that might have, I'm surprised to keep on seeing the references to the valuation of assets, the asset valuations, where we supposedly have dealt with it again and again, and we should have sorted it out. We haven't completed it yet. That's going 3 years at least now, year on year.
So in relation to the IT recommendations, it's very much how we gain our assurance. And so what we do is we have our IT specialist team come in and they do the work. And that is around things like logical access control, change management, and all the things that kind of happen behind the systems. Which is why they're very kind of detailed, and sometimes they do look a bit like they're, you know, like passwords. It's fairly simple, but actually they are the things that enable kind of the back end of the systems to be secure, so that we can rely on the front end and what comes out of that front end. So that's why there are so many, and they are kind of very, very detailed. But as I say, they were for our processes, and the way we do our audit approach. KPMG may have a slightly different take. In terms of valuation of assets, I think this is something that is a bit of a bone of contention in local government, and it is something that SIPFA are looking at going forward, because of the way that accounting standards work. There is a lot of estimate and judgment in valuation of property, and obviously as a council you have lots of like those types of assets. So for us as auditors, there's always going to be that risk around valuation, because you've got such a significant balance. If there's a small difference in an assumption, it can be a material amount. So I would imagine until SIPFA come through with a proposed change in the way that we apply the accounting standard, the valuation of property, plant and equipment will always come through as a risk, because of that level of estimate and judgment involved in valuing those assets.
So just to come back very, very quickly, on the valuations, for example, we are using a system generally based for a lot of this, a beacon system, you know, that kind of thing. You're making some references here about the beacon system, you know, the differences from the beacon are significant, all that kind of thing, they're justified, etc. And I'm worried, for 3 years now we're hammering that issue. Should I be telling our officers, hey, what's going on? You know, why it hasn't been solved out? Or is it something beyond? What's your opinion? I'm not an expert, I can't sort it out. But when I hear this thing, so I'm thinking, why is it still a problem?
So I think there's very different between kind of operational valuation and the valuations that are done for the financial statements purposes. And our risk is purely around applying those valuation standards, which are very complex and need sort of specialist involvement from RICS qualified valuers. So from my perspective, it's nothing that I don't see in any other organisation. I think if you looked at every local authority, they would have valuation of assets as a risk because of that level of judgment. But from obviously we've not completed our testing, so I can't give you any assurance. But from what I've seen, there is nothing that is any different from any other organisation that I've looked at.
Thank you, Rachel. I think there's no more further questions, so thank you so much. The recommendation is to note the report. Thank you. So now we'll move on to item 9, which is the internal audit progress report 24-25 quarter 2. So can I now invite Lead Officer Minesh Jani to introduce his report.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the usual report you receive from me, committee. The report goes up to the period 31st of October 24. The key things I'd highlight for you are the following. Internal audit had completed 40% of its audit plan for the year, which is about 316 days of the 800 days in the plan. That is slightly behind schedule because a couple of audits were put back. But I'm still hopeful that we'll finish the audit plan by the end of March as planned. The second element I would highlight is the work that was completed since the last meeting in October. 5 internal audit reports, final reports were issued. Of the 5, 1 was given the highest level of assurance, which is substantial assurance. 1 was assigned an adequate level of assurance, and then 3 were assigned a limited level of assurance. If I turn to the 3 limited assurance reports, the first was around our governance arrangements for delivering our savings. Just a very quick introduction to that. So the purpose of this audit was to review our arrangements and to make sure that they were essentially robust. The auditors noted that there were some good practices. So there is a good financial framework for the medium-term financial planning process that's prepared and approved and maintained at a good level. And that's important because that allows for us to know what level of savings we need to deliver to set a medium-term financial plan. The auditors also noted that there were regular and up-to-date pro formas designed to capture all savings opportunities, and that provides a means of consistency in making sure that when we look at these savings opportunities, we consider all the different elements, particularly the risks and the mitigations we need to make to deliver the actual savings. The audit, however, was assigned a limited assurance because there were some gaps. And the gaps noted were that of the 149 savings proposals that we had in the plan, a number, 24, didn't have a proper RAG rating attached to them. And that's important because that RAG rating then determines what level of intervention is necessary to deliver the savings. And that was one of the issues. The second point that the auditors noted was that where the risks and mitigations had changed from the original proposed plan, that hadn't been updated fully on the pro formas. So essentially, the risk profile was the old risk profile, not the new risk profile. And the third, which was a slightly more minor point, was that the proposals require the director or the assistant director to formally sign off the saving proposal, and that hadn't happened in some cases. So the auditors gave a sort of a limited assurance on the basis of those findings. If I just pause there and maybe take any questions thus far. So the next area was the management of staff performance. So the purpose of this audit was to ensure that staff performance is consistently managed across the organisation and to maintain a high level of quality workforce in the organisation. The audit noted that there are processes set up for regularly appraising staff through a system called My Conversation. There is also a process for making sure that the feedback and the mechanics of improving staff performance is there. However, the auditors did raise 3 priority 1 recommendations. The 2 substantive issues were that there needs to be a sort of standardized performance management framework to ensure that all our staff are appraised in a sort of consistent way. And the second area was that where my conversations take place, and this is the route by which we appraise staff, that is all properly logged on our systems. As it turns out, there are some difficulties in how that is captured. So that limits how much information is available to our HR colleagues around the organization's compliance with our My Conversation process. I'll pause there and take any questions as well.
Thank you, Manager. So just a quick question on this one. Is this a trend across all areas, or is this concentrated in a particular area that needs acute focus? Just some clarity on that. And then to what extent are best practices across services being shared with those that are not performing in these areas? Thank you.
So the issue of My Conversations being recorded on the system, that is across the organization. And what that does is that My Conversations might be happening, but they're just not logged on a system. So it's hard to know to what extent they're happening. In terms of best practice, I think what the auditor suggested was that there needed to be a regime in the absence of a formal recording somewhere for that information to be captured, because that's so crucial in understanding how effective we are in appraising our staff on a regular basis. And they benchmarked us against other authorities where that happens more regularly. And it was their view that actually doing that will improve our management arrangements of staff performance.
Thank you.
Councillor Mason.
Thanks for that. Can I just ask about where the accountability for HR lies? Does it sit with within each department? And is there an overall council HR policies processes who take responsibility for making sure that's consistency is in place?
Thank you. Yes. So the accountability rests with management. So the responsibility for making sure that staff are formally appraised rests within the directorates. However, we have an HR function which straddles the whole of the organization, and it applies that second line of defense, that second level of control, to ensure that where the compliance isn't as strong as it should be, it can weigh in and ensure that compliance happens.
Yep, sure. Please.
Thank you. So The overarching council, HR, the ones who hold that, they are going to take responsibility, are they, for ensuring that these standardised mechanisms are in place?
Sorry, Councillor. I forgot to answer your other bit of the question. So the responsibility for setting the standards for the organisation rests with HR, and in that regard, this audit and the recommendations raised in it have been addressed to HR.
Thank you. I just noted that it's 3 priority 1 recommendations, so it's quite high, a huge number. And I'm a bit concerned because staff performance appraisal is also linked to a lot of other, it's not just recording my conversation, it's about career progression, it's about reward. And I'm thinking to the huge turnover that sometimes we see of staff, use of agency staff. So I'm not sure if it was within the scope of the audit, but could, I don't know, this be linked somehow and could have contributed to what we see on in terms of those two facts. Thanks.
Yeah. So Councillor Vazetti, I think so. The agency element of our workforce was not part of this audit. That in fact we've done a separate audit in that area. I think your earlier point is absolutely right, though, which is that it's really important as an organisation that we use our staff resources as effectively as we can, and regular conversations through our process is an important way of making sure that our staff are fully appraised of what we're trying to achieve, what the goals of the organizations are, and aligning them to the work that they're doing and feeding back regularly as to how they're progressing. So that was really the purpose. And I'm sure improvements in that area will lead to a whole host of outcomes. Some are tangible, some are less tangible. Yeah.
Is there any more questions on this item? No? You want to move on to the next one? Manish, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So the final area was around our new operating model and the Procurement Act in particular, which comes into force in 2025. So really the objective of the audit was to assess whether we have adequate procedures to manage our affairs with the new operating model that's coming in February 2025. Actually, the auditors noted that there were some good practices again that had been put in place. So the service has taken the initiative to try to use the pipeline, that essentially a new framework that central government has developed, and try to come up with a contract register for us to help us understand those contracts where we will need to act earlier to help us move in line with the new act. And the contract standing orders are also being updated. But overall, this area was assigned a limited assurance. And that's primarily because it's really, really going to be important for us to make sure that our staff are properly trained in understanding what the new regime is. Some steps have been taken in this area, but we haven't got to a point where we've identified all the staff that need the training and then properly appraised ourselves of what level of training they need to be able to do what we need them to do around the Procurement Act. And that is quite a lot of things to do there, but we haven't really made enough progress there. So the audit was assigned limited assurance.
On this, I got Councillor Small and I got.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Manish. I'm just trying to get a bit of a temperature check on the report. Seemed quite pessimistic about where we were at, and then you started quite optimistic and ended pessimistically. And I'm not entirely sure. I'm trying to pitch where you are considering we're at in terms of actually delivering this effectively and getting the value for money that the Act is intended to do so.
I am pessimistic.
Okay. Thank you. Chair, I don't know what the process is, but it would be useful to hear from officers, particularly on this, because I think the Act was introduced in October last year and sort of had 18 months, and now we're approaching February 25. It would be useful to hear from officers exactly how we're sort of going to take advantage of the value for money stuff. That'd be great. Thank you.
If I can just say a couple more words to my previous statement, which was very blunt. The thing is, not just us, a number of London boroughs are finding it difficult to just place themselves in the right environment to be able to deal with the new Act. And it is likely that there will be a period of bedding in of about a year or so. So it's not as if we're going to fall off the cliff at the end of February. Nevertheless, though, in my role, I think it's really important that I use these audits as a means of making sure that the organization is as prepared as it should be. And at this point, it probably isn't, but I'm hopeful that through this forum and through my work, we can encourage the service to be there by the time we really need to use the Procurement Act fully.
Barry, you want to come?
I feel I should come in actually, given that it's under me. So look, we accept all the recommendations that have been put forward in the report. I think it was a bit of light relief when the Procurement Act was delayed from October last year to February of 2025. I think it is fair. We are, in terms of that, we often talk about the organisational readiness. You might hear me say that twice tonight. We aren't where we need to be, particularly in terms of the training. I think what I can say is that the strategic procurement team is very much mobilising themselves for the Act. They are getting themselves up to the new requirements, what's required, really understanding. I think we've often talked about, all the notices that need to be published every time we tender a contract. So I feel like we've got that knowledge quite extensively within the strategic procurement team. The next challenge that we've got is actually not all procurement activity happens within that team. So we need to absolutely identify the right people across the organisation. And now that my procurement team might not like me saying, now that they are the experts, actually we now need those experts to go out across the organisation. Am I confident we will be completely there by February? The answer is probably no. However, what we will need to be able to demonstrate is our roadmap to become completely compliant. So that's what we will be publishing. And I think it's a fair, I think it's fair for Audit Committee to get that assurance to ask for a further update, a follow-on meeting. That can either be January, or you may want to wait until the one that's after the implementation date of February, and we bring back a full update, which includes that roadmap to full compliance. I would echo what Manesha said. So I'm quite often with my equivalents across London. We're not unique in that, really quite nervous about the additional requirements that are coming along, but we're trying to prepare as best we can. But I do think being able to, got legal colleagues that sat to my right, hopefully we want to be able to demonstrate that roadmap to compliance at the point that we get to February. And I think that's what you as an audit committee I need to demonstrate that to you.
So, Rennie, I think I had a question.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to clarify, was the implementation of the new procurement system out of scope in terms of the new operating model? Because of course, I assume there's a readiness element that needs to be incorporated from the system perspective as well, if I recall correctly from the previous conversations that we've had.
Yes, that was not part of this audit.
Isidoros?
I think this audit is focused on a very particular aspect about adjusting to the new legislation, which is important, and we've got to meet it. But to add to your burdens, Taryn, I think the concerns about our procurement systems until now have been predating that, still are unresolved. Still, we're not satisfied. I think most of us about the value for money, the safety of the way it happens, the propriety sometimes, even in certain aspects, the way that certain people, contractors, etc., are treating us and all that kind of thing, etc. So I think we've got to always remember that that's not the be all and end all at this moment in time of that particular thing. And numerous audit reports from the past have been raised various aspects of that, and some of them haven't been met yet.
I mean, Minesh might have something to add. I mean, I think there's three elements of procurement that this committee needs assurance over. You've mentioned the system implementation. It wasn't part of this scope, but it is part of a future internal audit review. I think there is assurance around compliance with the Procurement Act, so post-February. I also think, therefore, Councillor, picking up on your point, that general assurance around our procurement processes, but also our contract management processes. So I think I sat here back in July or potentially October and talked about an all-encompassing, almost a report that there's lots of things happening in the procurement space, including there is a lot of previous internal audit reviews that have been done. And I think it might be helpful to bring forward to this committee, let's park the system just for a second, but maybe when we come with the Procurement Act update, almost to cover off where we are with those recommendations from previous internal audit reviews, but equally to give you some of that assurance around the improved governance that I think needs to be put in place around our contracts, our procurement processes, our contract management. And I think, Councillor, that picks up on your value for money aspect. And that is very much work in progress. But it needs to be quite an urgent piece of work now, given, you've all heard me talk about the amount that we spend on contracts. So I think that value for money aspect is really critical. So I think probably, I know I haven't delivered that to you yet. I still think that's an action that you should hold me to account for, to bring that all-encompassing update.
Sorry,
So if you can speak, if you can speak to the mic.
and we've seen some of those in terms of starting and stopping, which ends up being a really, really enormous waste of money, or money not well spent, I suppose. So the question I've got really is, how will that be reported back to us as an improvement? Because we want to know how we will know that contract management has improved. You don't have to answer it now, but just in thinking about the importance of the change that had taken place, the question about how we know that the contract management has improved and how that will be reported to us. Yeah.
I will come back with a much more detailed response once I've had time to think about it. But I guess my initial response is around, we collect an awful lot of data on our contracts. We collect an awful lot of what I would call compliance data. There is something, so certainly I want to be introducing an internal procurement board where I want to be reviewing that compliance information. There is something for me about that data will also give you some assurance. So if I take that away, it might be a bit of work in progress. Need to establish something internally first, but maybe when I come and give a further update in February, March meeting, almost give you an idea of timelines and some of the changes that I want to be putting in place. But I think ultimately that's one of the ways that you would get that assurance.
I'm going to just read out the recommendation. So you had a question? Minesh, do you want to come in? So
Just I suppose, just to complete Tara's point, once management have responded with their suggestions, you'll always have me doing the internal audit work and providing you assurance from the reports that I do.
Sorry, Chair, because I had an overall question around
Okay.
the summary on page 38. around the overview of the internal audit plan and the assurance levels that we currently have. I'm not normally a pessimistic person, but it's quite a pessimistic view with the limited assurance that's been granted over the course of the year. So, and I guess through the chair, it's a lot of information that we keep getting from either the officers on where they are with the remediation. So, can I suggest that we table a issue tracker on the issues that will move this dial from limited assurance to at least reasonable assurance or substantial assurance, because then as a committee we are more engaged at each meeting of what's on track, what's not on track, and then why it's not on track. Yeah.
Is that something that we can document and produce?
Good idea.
Yeah. Okay.
What is the implementation of Panacea, first of all, and why, when it will be said? And secondly, are those that have been cancelled in your overall list? Those have been cancelled. Particularly the youth offending one, I was wondering what the reasons are for cancelling it. If you have it. It's on your summary list of the currently.
Thank you. That's useful. So I'm planning to bring a paper to the January meeting with the additions and deletions to the original plan. So if I can answer your question fully, if that's okay. Sure. I think Panacea is the new source to pay application. That it's the new system, the new procurement system that the organization is looking at as a solution. Yes, its purpose is for that purpose.
Okay, so we just need to if there's not any more further questions and comments from officers, I'd just like to just read the recommendation. So the recommendation is to note the audit coverage and follow-up work completed. Okay, thank you. So I'll move on to the next item, which is the anti-fraud and corruption progress report. And can I now invite Vanessa to introduce her report? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Vanessa Bateman, Deputy Head of Audit and Risk. So this is the usual template for our report. Starts on page 45 of your pack and covers the period July to September, so Q2 of the financial year. Section 13 reflects a bit on risk profile. Section 14 outlines the work plan for the year, which includes a number of proactive fraud exercises. Within section 15, I update and you'll see fraud in housing remains a significant area of work for us. Our KPI outcomes are slightly behind target, but I expect that to change by the end of the year. We've obviously touched on the right to buy activity earlier in the meeting. Although the numbers have spiked, I think probably when we start to get into the detail, a number of those applications will fall away for various reasons and won't necessarily be fraudulent. I suspect a number have been made in haste. And there is quite a lot of criteria, not only within obviously the money laundering regulations, but also within the right to buy legislation itself that the application needs to meet. The Blue Badge project continues, and we're hoping to embed a full process into the next financial year. We're working with IT on that currently. Council uploaded the mandatory data sets to the National Fraud Initiative during the period, and we will get the results of that in Q4. I've continued to track results of last year's void property project and have written to the new head of tenancy management to try to get the project closed off with all the outcomes recognised. As part of this work, we did know a £3,000 overpayment that had been made via direct payment. So we've worked to highlight that to the service and make sure the recovery action is taken. Onto page 53, I am now. So squatting has been an additional sort of source of referrals for us this year. We're supporting the housing service more from an audit and risk perspective on squatting currently, because we've got no real evidence of any employee fraud and corruption involved. But the referrals did come over with that as one of the concerns. We've supported revenues colleagues recently with some trends around fraud in the housing benefit space, which is obviously not within our jurisdiction, but the processing of the application still falls within our remit. So our colleagues still see trends and raise concerns for us to support them with. We have 2 employee cases open. We did have 3 referrals that were all opened and closed within the period, but we've got 2 cases open. Dual employment cases have been higher this year. In some of these cases, we're just gathering evidence for other organisations, but it is an area of focus for all fraud teams really across local government. We looked in, we had 2 whistleblower referrals in quarter and they were both closed. We've got 1 that remains open. Thank you, Chair.
So any questions? So I got Councillor Small noted.
Thank you. Just on the blue badge fraud, I just note that there's of the 127 cases, there were 70 closed without further action, and it seems risk maths and Taran, I'm sure will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I think that's close to sort of 60% of which are sort of cases we've investigated, and I can conclude in deciding nothing wrong has been done. It seems quite a high number for us to be sort of 60% of our resources going after people who actually haven't done anything wrong. If you could just say a bit more about how we identify that and how we conclude it, that'd be great. Thank you.
There's not necessarily that there's no fraud found. So they would have all received a PCN for misuse of blue badge. And that sits within the Parking Enforcement Service. So the 127 cases that came over were all people that had received a fixed penalty notice for an offence. What we do is look into the extent of the evidence that we've got around that case. Some of those within that 17, I haven't necessarily got a specific breakdown, was we actually deployed 1 full-time officer on this project over a sort of a 3-month period. The cases came in to look at them, and actually some of it's time barred, so there's an element of capacity and being able to pick out the most serious of cases, and obviously there are others in there, but in terms of prioritising resources, there is an element of that within those 70, and we have, I suppose, if we apply sort of the risk-based approach on anything, our focus has been on repeat offenders and the worst cases of fraud. The ones that have gone through to prosecution really are where other offences outside of the blue badge fraud have occurred as well. So misrepresentation within our investigation, witness statements being provided, trying to counter the evidence that we were finding. So yeah, I think we sort of, there was a finite resource on this, and that's part of the factor in it.
Okay. Councillor Brennan.
So I have mentioned this before, and it is about the blue badge fraud and also the property. I just worked out this time, allegedly it's £480,000 for 6 properties that you've taken back. That supposedly it's worth £480,000. And I did note that even though you've put a sort of a scale of how much blue badge frauds are gaining, it's not what we're losing really, because I don't think that they would actually park on the street every day if they didn't have a blue badge. So basically we're not saving that much doing the blue badge, and are we satisfied that we're putting enough staff into reclaiming those houses, basically, because that's where the money is, and I think at the moment we should be following the money really.
We use the risk assessment to drive the activity of the team. This activity and these sort of the financial sanctions we're applying is bringing an income stream into the team, which we hope we'll be able to use to bolster our resources for the future. Also, we've got a very experienced but aging fraud team. So we need a succession plan, and we need to look at that for the future. The other element, and I probably maybe haven't touched on this within the report, but in the numbers it's clear, we have had to step back a bit from the housing fraud work while the housing improvement programme works, because there is an element of we can keep pushing cases through, but if we're hitting capacity in other teams to deal with some of the issues and we go through a legal process with some, I could have 10 investigators, but exponentially that wouldn't create 10 times the outcomes of work. So I mean, we're a small team and we do work hard, and we are pulled into different sort of audit related matters as well. But we just have to strike that balance using the risk assessment. And I have sort of linked to the conversation, just done all of my conversations with my team, I'd like to note. And one of the things I've expressed to all of them is that we are, as a team of sort of 6 investigators, going to have to come back together as a team and focus on housing fraud. That will be our project priority as a team next year. I knew you'd be pleased to hear that, but we also need certain commitments from other teams across the council to make sure that what we do gets the outcomes, and we get them in the most efficient way as we can, because we can only do it if we all work together. So that is our sort of plan and strategy for next year. We've got loads of things to try and close off before we can step back and focus on the housing thing, but I do understand like where you're coming from with the numbers. But the blue badge work has brought in an income stream that will really help us to sort of be a team for the future.
What is a small follow-up, Kathy?
Yeah. So will you be increasing the sort of like manpower on the housing on this as a result from what you're saying?
So the right to buy will help me, because my team member that looks at all of the right to buy applications from both the fraud and the money laundering regulations perspective, I'm expecting once we get through this peak of work, he'll have a lot less to do on the right to buy. So actually that he's a housing resource, but half of his time is spent on right to buy. So we will pull that back. We've got 2 or 3 sort of employee investigations on that, peaks and troughs, but again those are investigators trained in housing fraud that once those investigations are sort of got to a certain point can come back and take on a sort of a greater housing caseload. So yeah, I think in terms of percentages across the team, my reports next year will be talking to you about bigger percentages of work focused on the housing investigations. However, I would say as a team, pretty certainly in terms of my role at the moment, I would say I'm pretty much 80% focused on all things housing. So they are getting a share of the audit resources.
Thank you. So, yeah, Councillor Diakidis.
Thank you. Two questions both actually happen to be for my own education, but the one in the part about whistleblowing referrals, and I notice seems like there is a bit of an increase, from previous times, but you're referring to the one of the cases where there might have been a case to answer, but the employee had left. And I'm just wondering, because we've come across other cases on which some serious, I hope that wasn't very serious, some serious ones, where you couldn't really say, we couldn't even ask that person because he left, despite the fact there were millions of pounds involved. So I would be grateful if you could explain when an ex-employee, can somebody just leave, the council then and then just we stop the investigation, or when we don't? And the second question, just to add it very, very briefly, we've been using in the past, you've been using a yardstick to cancel if an addition or a loss of a council flat or house, how much is estimated on average to be costing our budget a year? And it was, I can't remember, 18,000 some years ago. I wonder is it still the same amount, and the net cost or benefit, if you like? Thank you.
I think that new figure is in my report. Obviously, they are notional savings figures that we use. The 18,000 was a long-standing issue for a lot of years. I think back into the Audit Commission days. I've got a feeling within the report it's 42. It's gone up to around 40. Again, sort of notional average savings provided normally by sort of good practice or fraud organisations to us. So yeah, that's the second bit of your question. Yes, it has gone up and it's about 42. That's what we're working with now.
I mean, just to understand. So if we were to get 10 extra units next year for some reason, then we save in our budget £400,000 a year. Is that what it means? I mean,
they're not necessarily cashable savings.
No, but I mean, there would be. But anyway, it would be useful to understand that figure exactly, because for most people it sounds extraordinary.
Yeah, we can do a bit more analysis in terms of financial values and bring that back in a future report. In terms of the first question around, so it very much depends. We have quite a lot of cases where the fraud team will focus on the seriousness or the criminality potentially, but actually we would separate out any contractual breaches that fall under the disciplinary policy. So we would investigate both under the fraud strategy in the same, so we sort of apply the zero tolerance to fraud, but some matters we need to actually move through the disciplinary process quickly. So the employee will have gone from the organisation. It doesn't mean a fraud investigation wouldn't continue. The case that you're picking up within my report, it was referred to us very, very shortly before the person was leaving. They'd resigned anyway. It wasn't anything to do with our affair or why they were leaving the organisation. That resignation was in train. The issue was around them having a conflict of interest. Now, I've had a look at that retrospectively, and I feel were they still a current employee, we would be raising a recommendation that there's sort of a small investigation under the disciplinary policy was done, but it would only be a breach of sort of employment contract. It wasn't a fraud matter. So ultimately the person had left before it came to light. All I've done with that has gone back to the service and to HR with the lessons learned, because actually the conflict of interest hadn't been, the declaration of interest hadn't been made by the officer, and actually the potential conflict of interest was reasonably well recognised within their colleagues. So there was a failing there within the council, but we've picked that up as a lessons learned.
So Councillor Mason? No, Councillor Mason. You're fine?
Yeah, sorry, my mind's blank.
Short one and small one.
I saw in the report it said that you'd got 18,000, 42,000, and then it gone to cabinet saying it was 78,000 for the value for the houses. It's written in this report.
Be specified which page is it?
Huh?
Which page?
Oh, which page? Glasses. It's right here. Yeah, page 50. Top of page 50. Most recently, the Cabinet Office has valued a property recovery at 78,300. That's where I got my 48,000 from. 480,000 rather, sorry. Yeah.
I think that's right. Just 2 points. First, these are notional figures, so they're not actual money, unfortunately. But my second point would be that I was just reflecting on a case that I brought to the committee about 2 years ago that we prosecuted, where someone had basically got a council property but were not using it as their main residential unit. And in that particular case, if memory serves me correctly, that misuse had been going on for a number of years, 5-6 years. So you can see how easily it is possible to get these notional figures in that ballpark figure, because if we take 5 years, for example, current rent in London, sort of, I don't know, 15,000, 18,000. a year, you could easily get these numbers very, very quickly. And now,
Temporary accommodation.
oh yes, and temporary accommodation is something else. I know other London boroughs where, you know, they've identified a fraud for misuse of 20 years plus. So, you know, you can easily add these numbers up very, very, very quickly, but they are notional. And we use this to guide our work, but yeah, we've got to be a bit careful.
Thank you, Minesh. That's fine. So, Rennie, you remembered your question now.
Yes,
right?
I do.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you for that, Chair. So it was just coming back to a point that you'd raised earlier around addressing housing fraud and resource capacity within your team, and then the potential sort of knock-on effect in other areas, and that being a potential bottleneck. And the question was, to what extent is this sort of risk management approach aligned across the council more broadly? Because if you're recognising it as a significant area, then I would expect housing services to align with that and throw whatever resources required to be able to facilitate and achieve the objectives there. Thank you.
I think the tension, I think, so specifically, I suppose it's the tenancy management service. So they're currently restructuring to reduce the patch sizes so that the officers have got a more manageable workload. And I think that the challenges at the moment in housing is fraud is a priority, and we could, you know, but there's a lot of other priorities. And if they're dealing with an inbox where it's all on the ground, vulnerable tenants, or they have to do the checks that Jahed mentioned earlier, they've got a, you know, rota of checks to do. ASB might come through, problems with accessing properties for repairs or for gas safety, all runs through that team. So as much as we can turn around and say, like, we could make a decision that actually this tenancy fraud is the highest priority for them, actually operationally on the ground, they're facing a number of other sort of things that are really day-to-day high priority. But there has been a restructure in the area which is being implemented. We've seen in recent months the resource capacity is increased within that team, and there is a new head of tenancy management, and she's been promoted from within, so she's not coming in new and finding her feet. She's been in the service quite a few years, and now she's stepped up to be the head of service. So my team are already saying to me that we're feeling the benefit of those changes. So I'm optimistic that if we get, you know, all the team working from April around the housing fraud space, then other teams are aligning with that as well.
Okay, that's helpful. I think I was coming at it from, from the perspective of that whole notion of value for money. If that's how we're describing it, then this is effectively value leakage. So just trying to align those priorities. So that's helpful. Thank you.
So much. Thank you, Vanessa. So the recommendation for this report is to note the activities of the team during the Q2 of 2024 and 25. So now I'll move on to the next item, which is the quarterly treasury management update report, and it's Tim Mupufu. Tim.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. My name is Tim Mpofu, and I'm the head of pensions and treasury here at Haringey. So the report that I'll be presenting to you today is the Treasury Management Media Report. So that covers 6 months from the 1st of April 2024. So this report is similar to the ones that we provide to this committee at each meeting. Essentially just provides an update on the Treasury management activities over the period. So there's just a few things to highlight to members or to bring to your attention within the report. The first thing is really on the economic background. So in the earlier part of this this period, inflation started to come down and actually reached the 2% target for the Bank of England in May. But since then, inflation has actually started to tick upwards. And as a result, I think the most recent reading is around 2.3%, which is above that target. So this appears that inflation is more persistent than was initially forecast. I think towards the end of this year, people thought inflation might actually be going below 2%. And as a result, the assumptions on the cost of borrowing or rates remains high. So in section 6.9, Alan Close, our Treasury advisors, they issued their most recent updates on the future rates or the future path of rates. Initially, they had forecast that by the end of next year in 2025, the rates will go to 3%. That's now been revised upwards to 3.75%. So it just shows that I think the rates are going to stay higher for longer, which is obviously a bit of a concern in terms of any ongoing borrowing decisions. To add to that kind of elevated level of rates, what we've also observed over the period is there's now enhanced volatility, which essentially means the market is responding to any news factors very rapidly. So in between weeks, we can see some swings in terms of the rates. And this was obviously compounded by the Chancellor's budget in autumn statement, but also the US political announcement of the presidential elections. So I say this to just maybe highlight that even going forward, this volatility is likely to remain as more policy announcements are made. We do expect that that will still be within the that will still be feeding through in the markets. In terms of borrowing, so the council still has an ambitious capital program, and we're obviously trying to borrow in line with that, but also trying to make that balance between making sure there's low risk, but also securing the low interest rates where we can. So over the period, borrowing increased by about 73 million. A large element of that, in fact, most of it was in short-term lending, which we received from other local authorities. Again, that was a strategic decision, given how high the rates were, to kind of defer some of those decisions until later in the year, once the budget picture is more clearer for the council. But going forward, the council will likely be taking more longer-term borrowing from the PWB. Again, we're keeping a close eye on that movement in rates and where opportunities present themselves. For example, since over the last 10 days, we've seen the impact of all those policy events almost come out the markets now, 30 basis points reduction, which would present a good opportunity for the council to take some borrowing and secure those lower rates. From an investment perspective, the cash balances have remained relatively the same. Sometimes we do get spikes every now and again, but on average, it's around 40 to 45 million is what we have in the council's bank at any point. We have been able to deposit that around 5% throughout the course of the year. However, that's obviously taken downwards as the Bank of England continues to cut rates. You'd expect that to be felt through the amount that the council is able to receive in terms of deposits on overnight rates. So, for example, since the Bank of England has reduced the amount we're getting is around 4.7% compared to about 5.19% earlier on in the year. And then just a final point before opening up to questions, just to again highlight the key prudential indicators in section 8 of the appendix to this report, that all the treasury management activities were carried out in accordance with the CIPFA code, as well as the treasury management strategy. So those are the few things I would like to highlight, but of course, happy to open up to questions from members, Chair.
Thank you, Tim. Questions from members? Councillor.
Just wanted to ask about the additional 73 million that was borrowed, and it's mostly short-term borrowing. If you can say a bit more, because I was going through the paper. I think you said something about short-term borrowing, but I'm not sure if it was referring to this amount or it was a general consideration. Thanks.
Yes, I can confirm I was referring to the amount that I think is on table 3 or table 2 on 3.3. So all that short-term borrowing is from other locals. So on average, the borrowing we had as the date was 5.11%, which when you compare with some of the rates in terms of the PWB, they were much higher over that period. So we are looking for opportunities where we can get the best value in terms of our borrowing decisions. And over that period, short-term lending was much more, I suppose, better than getting and locking in higher rates.
Further questions? No. Go on, Councillor Daguid.
Tim, on the Lobo loans, did I understand it right? You said basically, although there was a possibility, we didn't get any options offered to us for the first 50 million this year, but there are another 50 million coming next year. Yeah. And your perception is that is like, or it could be possible that some turn up, because I believe right now we'll be paying more interest than we would have otherwise, but, and so on. If you can explain a little bit where we are.
Happy to do so. So in terms of logos, we did have one logo that was refinanced, or the option was available every 2 years. So that was one that we refinanced in the last financial year. Since then, we have 50 million of that, which is every 5 years. So I think there's about 4.5, 3 years before that is called. So the risk of that being actioned remains really low. We then have a variety of loans. I think there's about 2 or 3 of them that are much more shorter dated. But when we've talked to Island Close, those particular lenders, there is no appetite for them to get out of those deals, because the way they structure them is using sort of like swap contracts on the other side, and actually it's much more expensive for them to come out of those contracts. So the main lenders who've been keen to exit this is they don't want it on their balance sheets, so they pay the price. And essentially it will be a process of coming to the council and saying, we're going to increase the rates above what the council would find acceptable. So for example, in a rate where rates are around 5%, I would say 7%. So obviously would look to refinance that and get some PWB. So I think on both of those, it remains really low. Just one is too far into the future, and the other one, there is no appetite from the lender to get out of that contract.
Are they open-ended then? If they never exercise their option, we will be there in 100 years' time.
Yeah, well, it's not 100 years time. I was just going to see if I can dig up, but I won't be able to get the information quickly enough. But I believe on most of the logos, they're around 20 plus years still to run on them. So a lot of them will be 2050, 2060 is when their full term comes up. So when they were initially taken out, they were around 50-year terms on those logos back in 2004, 2005. So there will be those periods over the course of time where there might be significant changes. Like, for example, if rates went to 10%, I'm sure a lot of the local lenders will be looking to come out of those rates, but it doesn't seem likely in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Tim. So the recommendation for this item is to note the treasury management activity undertaken during the financial year to 30th of September 2024 and the performance achieved, which is attached as Appendix 1 to the report. Recommendation 2 is to note that all the treasury activities were undertaken in line with the approved treasury management strategy. And so those are the 2 recommendations to note. And I've got a news to read, which is some of you may be already aware, Tim will be leaving us before the Christmas period. And I would like to ask the Audit Committee to join me thanking Tim for his hard work and stewardship. I am certain everyone here would like to wish him well in his future endeavors. Thank you for all your hard work, Tim. Thank you. Okay. Right. Thank you so much. So the date for the future meeting, it's on the 27th of January. Can I now ask everyone to be seated so we can have an informal update? Because you came late, I have updated. But so we can have an informal update. So if you can just end the meeting. Tim, you can go. It's fine.